Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm very excited about this second day of the workshop as well. Milton, Karine, thank you so much for organizing this. This has been quite exciting and refreshing in many ways. And I think it's all a lot to think about. We start off this panel today with kind of like reflecting on AI governance efforts, industrial policies, including that to kind of think about what's actually happening in terms of governance in particular countries, as well as international organizations. And the agenda says we're going to talk about the EU, China, India, and the US. Not sure if we're fully equipped to cover all of that in those, I think, 75 minutes, but we'll give us our best shot. There are a couple of people in the room who have also expertise in that. Jyoti, who is, I think, is already here, maybe not. We'll be here soon. Already talked about some of India's aspect of AI governance, so that we kind of try to collectively bring this in. The panel today is slightly differently structured. Yesterday we had like this, kind of more like presentations. This will try to have more interactive discussions. So I asked all panelists to kind of like, prepare short remarks around a set of questions, and then also what I want to do with that is to have if we'll have like the panelists start with those prepared statements, but then also everyone in the room can chime in. Between speakers, maybe one quick question is allowed with the first 45 minutes before we then open up the discussion to the workshop overall, and try to have this as a very interactive way to approach this topic on comparing AI governance approaches. And very briefly, I think yesterday we heard a lot about AI safety, guardrails, and the range of other topics. But I think when I think about AI, broadly speaking, there's also aspects of innovation policy, science policy, what infrastructure is needed to make actually AI possible. Laura, in the first day, expressed very briefly like the immense energy need to actually make AI work. To what degree do we need to talk about energy policy when you talk about AI? Is that something we need to talk about as well? And obviously, I think we're running that issue today as well, is kind of like, what is actually AI? Before we don't really know what AI is, as defined, it's kind of hard to actually regulate. And I think many countries have this challenge as well, not really knowing what they're actually trying to regulate. And that's, I think, a challenge. We'll talk about different acts. Maybe we come to the EU AI Act. We also should talk about things like the executive order, right? And I think Grace will probably talk about a little bit about that. But then also, all those international summits and processes where international organizations are involved that are an important part of, I think, AI governance in international relations. More recently, the US announced this partnership for global inclusivity on AI, kind of like a US effort to, tell the world that, the US has all these kind of great technical capabilities, but is willing and able to share them with everyone else. And so I think that's kind of another aspect to need to think about when we talk about making of governance of AI. It's not only about like laws that are passed, but also international processes and investments as well, plus industrial policy. And I think I'll stop here and hand over to our panelists. I asked them to make short introductory statement, 2 to 3 minutes. And I think we're starting with Sarah.
Thanks, Andreas. So really happy to be here. As Karine said, I'm sort of here, I am part of the New Zealand government, but I'm actually here as the 2024 New Zealand Harkness Fellow, and kindly hosted, in fact, by ORF America in DC for a couple of months. So just very quickly, what is the Harkness Fellow? It's basically an opportunity for mid-career public servants in New Zealand to take 3 to 6 months out in their day jobs and do some research and build networks in the US related to emerging and important issues that we face in New Zealand. And so my focus at the moment is AI governance, so it's really neat to be part of this event and part of this panel. So Andreas posed a couple of questions for us to tackle in our introductory remarks. And the first of those was, where are countries at in terms of AI governance? And from my perspective, I think countries really are at very different stages thinking about AI governance and regulation. And they're coming from very different viewpoints, depending on the economic context and depending on sort of the diversity of views that are bubbling up from society. That said, I think probably across the board, governments are struggling to understand and keep up with the technology itself, this moving target that they think that they want to steer. AI is present across all sectors, across so many different applications. It's very difficult for the public servants to keep up. Andreas said to us, well, what do you think one pressing issue is? And for me, I think disentangling this concept of AI safety, which permeates the international discourse, is really important. It's just such an all-encompassing phrase, and it has, to me, quite a fearful tone. So it actually risks stifling the uptake of, benign AI applications in countries that aren't the AI leaders and who aren't sort of immersed in this discussion about safety. I think we also need to reduce the proliferation of international AI initiatives, which are overwhelming smaller countries and probably actually reducing their voice internationally. And so in that respect, I really appreciated the discussion yesterday about the need for answering the question, well, AI governance for what? What goals and what harms? And I think we really need that clarity to kind of cut through this chatter that we have. Lastly, Andreas said, how did we get into AI? And I guess for me, it was during my time at the OECD, it became the topic that everyone wanted to talk about, right, Karine? And so it was by default in a way. I worked at the OECD for about 16 years prior to moving back to New Zealand. And in New Zealand, of course, the arrival of ChatGPT, all of a sudden, everyone wanted to talk about it. Politicians, public servants had to get to grips with it. So for me, that's how I found my way in. Thanks, Andreas.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for those remarks. And I think I want to quickly, on a conversation we had recently was about this, this overwhelming amounts of AI initiatives. You use this phrase about kind of like some countries have this fear of missing out, of not being part of it, but also you made the point about, guess what, when you get pulled in and some of the challenge that comes with that, because it's just overwhelming, because not only AI that the US is leading efforts and the other countries as well, but like there are a huge range of efforts that it's kind of a huge, drag on resources for state departments and other agencies to actually engage with these topics. Grace.
Hi, everyone. As Karine mentioned at the beginning, I'm in a transition period. I was most recently the chief of staff at NTIA, which is the agency in the US government that traditionally does telecom and internet policy. When I've worked at NTIA twice. When I came back this time around in March of 22, I came back to build a set of AI programs for the agency. And we ended up doing two big initiatives in that time period. I'll come back to them. But before NTIA, I was at a AI startup in the private sector. Before that, grad school, and before that, the internet governance space, where I read Milton's book and got inspired to sort of get involved. So that's kind of the path for me. The work that I did at NTIA sort of preceded the executive order. I think you have to think of, well, we've talked about this a little bit yesterday. You should think of the US government realistically as like a couple of years into AI governance, which is maybe counter to what most people think, but because there was a lot of activity, you could say there's almost been like 10 years of policy activity in the AI space. But I lived in Canada for a long time, but the Canadians had a national strategy in 2016. At that time, I was in the US government. The US government wasn't at a place where they would be putting out a national strategy or anything like that. So I feel like in some ways the US was a little bit later in trying to organize and coordinate its AI policy. And really much of that has happened in the past couple of years. Before in the Trump administration, I would say in the Obama administration, there were some efforts mostly to look at AI as an emerging technology, but not really proceed with any kind of governance mechanisms. And that's where you saw, that's where other countries that had strategies were sort of coming and talking about them and things like that. So that activity I saw at the end of the Obama administration. The Trump administration saw the creation of the National AI Initiative Office, which was an organization designed to sort of coordinate AI initiatives across the US government. And that structure still exists, but in the Biden administration is unused or underutilized. And the Biden administration really focused on there were sort of two phases, I would say. There was the first phase where there were folks at the White House and OSTP, and then some of the folks kind of in the defense and OMB space that had been working on AI applications and ethical use of AI. That's work started in the Trump administration, but continued into the Biden administration. And then there was the team at OSTP that was looking at this idea of creating an AI Bill of Rights. And that was modeled somewhat on some of the rights efforts that were ongoing in the like globally, but also on this idea that in 2012, the White House had published a privacy bill of rights, which was supposed to be a framework to think about privacy legislation. And so the idea at the White House was, let's put together this AI bill of rights, look at the question of whether there are specific rights that need to be considered or addressed in the context of AI systems. And then that would be a framework for legislation. So that document came out in September of 23, when I'm blanking on the dates because everything merges in my mind. Bill of Rights was October of 22. So that was published in October of 22. And then there was this effort that continued led from the White House to coordinate basically implementation of this Bill of Rights. And we can talk a little bit about, there were some challenges in getting the Bill of Rights published. Partly those challenges, like the big challenge came from the IC and the DOJ community, essentially because they were concerned that we were creating new rights that weren't actually in law, and they would be problematic in trying to do it for law enforcement. So, but eventually there were some caveats inserted into the Bill of Rights, and the Bill of Rights was published October 22, and there was sort of this path forward in working on administration-wide the questions around rights respecting or rights in the AI space and how you could implement AI in government and think about those things. Then ChatGPT comes out like right in November of 22. So that throws a lot of the Bill of Rights work, not out the window, but it sort of changes the conversation. As Sarah mentioned, a lot of that, a lot of the sort of attention on ChatGPT changed the way that people thought about how they could use AI and it was sort of a general purpose technology so the rights questions were not immediately relevant in the same way. And then that started the process for the executive order. And we can come back to that in the next sort of set of questions. But the executive order essentially became the main document. It was the longest EO in the US history. It was extremely comprehensive. It had everything from hiring guidelines to national security work to use of AI in agencies sort of pulling from the Bill of Rights. But it had one question that we had negotiated as it was the only policy question in the executive order, and that was this question around whether or not the government would do anything about open dual use foundation models with widely available model weights, which we abbreviate to open source AI. Very rough abbreviation, but essentially the question was whether the systems that were open posed any greater risk to national security than systems that were not. And that was originally not necessarily a question, but there was a push from folks in the administration to make that a question, and that question was assigned to NTIA because we were seen as folks that would be able to evaluate that question in a way that was fair and technically sound. So that became the main assignment at NTI. When I first started, most of our work was focused on the question around whether or not we could build out an accountability ecosystem and what that looked like. And we published that report. But that work and that report existed pre-executive order. And so there's this era in AI policy in the US government where you think of pre-executive order and post-executive order. The open model weights question was a post-executive order document. We published that this July. And this is essentially our main conclusion was that we didn't think that these systems posed any greater risk at this point in time than proprietary systems. And so we didn't recommend any kinds of restrictions on open systems. And that's a key to sort of the conversation yesterday that we had with Drew about, how you shape a revolution in technology, right? I think this question around whether or not you would have regulated a system that would have otherwise been open, I think is a key sort of decision point in our regulation of AI. So time will tell, maybe we were entirely wrong, but other organizations like the OECD have put out reports on whether or not they think open systems pose risks. So we're not alone in this argument, and I think that's a good time to transition over to
Great segue. Thank you, Grace. Karine, please, floor is yours.
Good morning. So my name is Perset, and I'm the acting head of the OECD division on AI and emerging digital technologies at the OECD. Sarah will be surprised. This is new. There's been a restructuring, but anyway, thank you so much for allowing me to join this virtually today. And I hope, having been in panels with remote participants, that I don't appear huge compared to the rest of the humans in the room. But anyways, it's great to see some of you again after a long time. I can't see everyone clearly, but I can. But it's great to see Sarah, Grace, and Milton again. So maybe jumping into the few issues that I see from here over in Paris at the OECD. A major issue in AI governance is that policymakers, but also users and industry, and frankly everyone, I think, is just overwhelmed by the AI policy information overload, and even the AI information overload. It's too much. It's too much for people to follow, and I'd echo what Sarah said about kind of the need to start, at least try to clarify who does what, because there's just this multiplication. It'll get worse before it gets better, but still there's a really strong need to clarify who's doing what, and you know, for example, we in July merged the OECD's work on AI with the work of the Global Partnership on AI, because there were overlaps, and you know, we wanted to build synergies, and that was one way to do it, to have at least one less venue. That doesn't mean that 10 others weren't created in the meantime, but I do feel that some of the conversations taking place are also fueling a lot of uncertainty and confusion, and that's probably normal, and it's probably going to last a little while, about what AI can do, or what AI will be able to do, and what the actual risks are, or the potential risks, but also the opportunities of AI. So what we're trying to do at the OECD is do what we can to bring a little bit of clarity into the kind of the confusion for doing things like agreeing among a lot of countries on what is AI, how do we define it, because we do need to define it if we're going to, for example, in the EU's case, regulate it, by making sort of recommendations that are based on evidence and collecting data on trends. So what type of AI is developing, you know, what amount of investments are being made, that kind of thing. And then also on the risk side, you know, what are the risks that we're actually, you know, that people think are dangerous, but that are actually materializing into incidents. So we developed an AI incidents monitor to help kind of track patterns of where AI harms or hazards are materializing, or on the contrary are not, or where things that we did not anticipate are happening. And the goal of that is really to help this evidence-based policymaking, and getting a little more clarity on what is actually happening and what is bound to happen, or what we can anticipate. So it's really about, I think, working together to collect data and understand what governance really needs, is the most pressing task, to make sustainable policies and regulations, in some cases, that can ensure that AI benefits our people benefits our societies broadly.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Before we transition to kind of the next set of questions, I want to see if there's any kind of very quick response within the room or a question maybe. Is there anything kind of like jumped out on taxonomy you want to follow up? If not, that's totally fine.
Just a quick question on sort of the definition of governance and what is included and what's not. Because on the one hand, when I look at, say, the US approach to AI governance, a lot of the harder governance or like formal law is distributed in a sector specific way. It's like the FDA will regulate the use of AI in medical products, for example. And that's not necessarily captured in any one of these EO documents or AI safety, whatever. And then on the other hand, the AI Safety Institute is, of course, within the Department of Commerce, and a lot of its recommendations are voluntary, as are a lot of the other Department of Commerce's sort of documents pertaining to AI. And so just what are some of your views on sort of the role of what seems to be a growing body of voluntary commitments that sort of fall under the umbrella of AI safety in the US? I know that might be different in other places. And again, sort of the sector specific hard law approach to AI governance and how should that frame how we're thinking about an international conversation about AI?
I think it's an excellent question, Carmen. I think it actually just nicely, don't want to
gonna
escape the question, but nicely goes into the next question. Or maybe we can collectively address that in that set, which is basically what's the role of governments in shaping, governing, regulating AI and controlling AI, and kind of looking at specific. Sorry, no, I thought the wrong question. Sorry about that. One step back. The next question was about an overview and comparing different AI governance approaches. Since Grace, since you were kind of the first to start on that question, maybe we can, hide some of those ideas.
So I think you're right. What I was gonna say on this question is that essentially the US approach, we discussed this a lot yesterday, but it's well, this is my view. This is not what we said yesterday, but my view is that it feels somewhat precarious right now in the sense that we don't have any laws that actually govern we don't have any laws that govern horizontally. Let's say that. We do have sector specific laws. In the sector specific space, what perhaps is missing is resourcing to actually enforce and interpret some of those laws in a new context. I don't think either at the government level, they think people are trying to get up to speed with how these systems work, but they may not have, this is new for them. So there's a little bit of a delayed effect there. And then there's a question where they may not have the resourcing to pursue sort of the analysis that may be required to enforce or something like that. So there's a little bit of a question mark on the US approach. Typically has been you regulate by sector, you don't necessarily regulate horizontally, but in the case where we do want to sort of embrace that approach with AI governance, what might be an issue here is whether these agencies are ready to do that, both on their own and with sort of external support and funding. So that's one issue. There's also this question, and you see this happening in the privacy space in the US, where we don't have a comprehensive privacy law. And so what happens is states are passing their own laws because they can't wait and they want to take action. In California, we talk about the California bill, SB 1070, I think, am I getting the numbers wrong? But essentially we talk about that bill primarily is like whether it was, whether the companies were happy with the model transparency and all these other things. But really like the piece that's interesting to me is that in vetoing that law, the governor basically gave the opportunity for Congress to pass a national law. That they could still pass a national law, but if you look at the debates on privacy regulation, there's this consistent question now about whether or not a privacy law will preempt state law. And that question is extremely complicated and hard to negotiate politically. So it's a little bit easier when you don't have state laws, because you can pass a comprehensive law that doesn't, easier, we can debate that, but I think politically it becomes more complicated when you are dealing with a California delegation that has passed a very strong law that you may not be able to mimic at the rest of in the rest of the country. So there's this question about what to do about in the US around if you do pass a law, when you pass it, how comprehensive it is and whether it affects states or not. Or I mean, how it affects states and their own actions on AI. There's tons of activity at the state level in AI bills. And we, as a general point on the US approach, I think it's very much right now, there's a lot of activity, a lot of sort of experimentation, perhaps that may not be the right word, but essentially like trying to get up to speed, trying to figure out what the right fix is. And we talked about this yesterday, Carmen, you missed the conversation about using compute as an approximation, right? There's this idea right now that we have a number that's 10 to the 26 operations that is sort of supposed to be the number by which you require more information from companies, et cetera. In the report that NTI wrote about open model weights, we had a similar sort of open conclusion in the sense where we said, you know, right now we don't think there are risks, but we should continue to monitor. And as we understand risks better, and as we are able to measure them, we may want to reevaluate this question. So that sort of leaves the door open to further evaluation. But I think at this point, this world of testing, evaluation, validation, et cetera, is still a new science and a new question. So until we get those measurements in place, everyone is trying to figure out what to do next. And that brings on all kinds of questions about global coordination and other pieces, which we can get to later.
But I would want to point out that yesterday, we also called into question the idea of the danger of human extinction. That is one of the main rationales for this idea that as compute power gets more powerful, it becomes more dangerous, right? And I wouldn't say we completely refuted that, but we certainly raised questions about the whole narrative that AI, uncontrolled development of AI poses literally a risk of human extinction, and it's comparable to the hydrogen bomb or something like that.
I actually meant to ask something else, Grace, but I'm curious, given what just Milton said, you know, given you were inside the administration, how much was that narrative kind of driving the conversation? Is this an outside conversation mostly, and people inside the government are very level-headed and are not as afraid about, you know, global distinction? Or
I think people were afraid of risks, but they were ill-defined. I think, well, ill-defined. There were different conversations happening, companies coming in to talk about their issues, think tanks coming in to talk about their issues. You know, it was all, you know, you look at the sort of the release of ChatGPT and the release of the executive order, that's 1 year. That's an extremely fast timeline. In government speak, like it was meetings constantly every day. You know, it was just a lot of work to get this machine to move across the government. So I think the conversations were there, people were aware of the risks, but they couldn't define them broadly. I mean, even in yesterday's conversation, we had some difficulty defining some of these terms, right? So you can imagine that for people that were not AI experts necessarily, that this was also kind of a difficult conversation to have. The one thing I will say, and I've said this before, I think there's a unique role for government. And we can argue about whether or not we think that we overemphasize this role in the US government, but there is a unique role for government in general to protect its citizens and to look at the low probability, high impact events, typically national security events, right? Like, this is not something that we typically outsource to the private sector or to the, you know, the market, right? Like, this is a sort of an inherently government function to think about securing the nation. And so whether or not you think there's actual human extinction or just the possibility, we talked about this yesterday, the possibility of the EO very much addresses this question about a bioweapon being formed and infecting a ton of people. You know, it doesn't have to be that it's human extinction. It could be some form of chaos, some form of disease affecting not necessarily the entire country, but a portion of the country. That is still something that is, as a government, you have to be concerned about and you have to address, and that's where you put government resources. So I think the idea that government looks at these sort of maybe lower probability and higher impact risks is not a crazy thing to be. What maybe might have been perceived is that we potentially over indexed on that. But if you read the entire executive order, there's a ton of other material in the executive order that doesn't have to do with that. It's just that the bulk sections, or the sections that were also primarily reported on, were sections about national security, biorisk, et cetera.
Let's getting on the question, so we're going to move on, and then we'll definitely open up, hopefully in time to get some more conversation going. Karine, turning to you, I'm not sure where the camera is. Well, look over here. Not sure if you can see us here. You know, now we heard something about the US approach to AI governance. How does it look like from the OECD perspective as an international organization? How do you approach AI governance?
Make sure she understands she's muted.
Oh, you muted, yeah.
Sorry. I think I'd actually echo a lot of what Grace said about the capacity of agencies, be they sectoral or not. So not just in the US, the capacities of agencies or, you know, regulators to do anything about what's happening, even when there are laws, and that's, I think, very much work in progress, and it's work that takes time. It's not going to be immediate that they're going to understand, you know, neural networks, and so that I think is a real priority. This kind of you know, capacity building, but also you, Grace, mentioned the enforcement capacity. That's huge. How are you, if you can't enforce something, well, you know, again, the likelihood is that whatever you regulate is not going to be as useful as if you could enforce it. Yeah, maybe. And then another thing is that I think is important is the availability of redress. So, I mean, you know, rights are great, including privacy rights and all kinds of rights. They're rights to all of our international human rights are very important, but only if you can obtain redress when you're harmed. So this is something that, you know, I can, so Grace would recognize, you know, you have some lightweight mechanisms to enforce certain rights, maybe, but we need something. We would ideally need something that would be actionable at a global level, because we're talking about companies that are operating everywhere, and we need these, you know, we need some kind of redress mechanisms, and again, that's going to take a lot of thought, and I haven't seen anything about that at all yet. The availability of redress for people who've been harmed, that would be quicker than the court mechanisms, or, you know, that would be more akin to what we have in consumer policy regulation, where we have alternative dispute resolution, and we have mediation, arbitration, things like that, that can resolve some of that can provide some kind of redress. But sorry, going back to your question, as an intergovernmental organization, the OECD, and actually I shouldn't be talking about OECD anymore. I should be talking about the Global Partnership on AI, because since this merger, the merger agreed to use the name Global Partnership on AI, which is a grouping of 44 countries. So it's larger than the OECD, and it includes countries like Brazil, India, Argentina. But this group acts as a kind of a forum, a global governance forum that brings together AI actors to promote consensus, common standards, and coordinate on policies on AI governance, and, you know, work towards consensus. It's not easy on some topics, and it probably isn't going to be easier the more countries you have involved, but it's really important because AI policy initiatives are emerging everywhere, and you don't want them all to be different. And without that coordination, they're all going to be different. But to be fair, at the same time, while governments are coordinating and working towards, well, what would be the right approaches. We are in a transition, and while we develop trustworthy by design processes, that's really an important point to make, that the trustworthy by design. I mean, in some cases, we don't really want to wait until the system is out in the wild to see what we can do about it. So we're going to need to have, we do need to have trustworthy by design processes and checks and balances, and then also for other types of systems, we'll need to have ex post testing, evaluation, validation, and so on processes. But while we're doing that, AI development is moving very, very fast. So there's a kind of a race. Can we prioritize the safety, or the, let's say, the making sure things are beneficial for people, while at the same time AI developments are just moving so fast. So on our sides, we've been working on AI since 2017. So we have a government layer. That's the sort of core. That's what the OECD is, an intergovernmental organization. But really importantly, this government layer is supported by a very large network of over now with the merger, I think 600 experts from countries around the world that are AI experts. So they're not governmental, they're AI engineers, they're civil society actors, and they really inform the work of these governments, because, and as I said, they also help in building the capacity of the governments or the regulators to understand what's happening. We have built a website at OECD.ai that tracks and showcases a lot of things, including national, regional policies and initiatives. But it also serves as a reference point to compare and contrast, because there's such a large variety of existing and emerging regulatory approaches, as Grace was mentioning. We have the US approach and the executive order, of course, but that we also have the EU AI Act that's going to be entering into force, and that is very which is generating a lot of work for a lot of people, and is a prominent example of sort of kind of a new horizontal regulatory approach on AI that's risk-based, and we also have other jurisdictions that are advancing AI governance by leveraging existing laws and regulations. So I think the jury's still out, but probably we will be needing a combination of both. And I think perhaps another point to make is that we do need to worry about fragmentation, because in AI regulation, because then we'll create loopholes, and that's something that we strive very hard to avoid. Where we'd have policies from different countries or regions, or working against each other and overlapping. And something really important that I want to say, because I was at the G7 meeting early Monday, Tuesday, is that where we've been working on this report monitoring mechanism for one of numerous voluntary codes of conduct, is that there's so many initiatives to create voluntary codes of conduct that they're not they don't seem to be stopping. I think it'll get worse before it gets better. We're imposing these compliance burdens on businesses and on users in some cases, and that really would require more coordination, because otherwise we will have and I won't give specific examples because I wouldn't speak against any, any of these initiatives, but there are many, and ideally they would at least align and not, not be different. They would at least align in terminology, not look like things that are completely different, because they are quite similar. They're all based on risk approaches. They're all based on risk management approaches. But if you look at them and you read them and you're not a risk management expert, they look very different, and they're imposing different things. So ideally, we would, try to align these as much as possible, so that businesses and the folks developing AI in research institutes and others can focus on what matters, which is really, how do we ensure that what we're doing doesn't cause harm and is positive and beneficial, instead of worrying about complying with, dozens of voluntary and mandatory frameworks.
I think it's really helpful, right? This idea of kind of like coordinate and consolidate as to move forward, right? The best thing we can do, I guess, sounds like coordinate and consolidate rather than grow further for some of those initiatives that are.
Yeah, but it's really hard, and here I will say that I'll say in an undercover manner that I think everyone wants to have their name on an instrument. And that was the biggest problem. And if we could forget about the names of the organizations, the institutions, and the countries, the cities, we'd be able to do that. But right now, everybody wants to have their name and be seen as the precursor, the first. Again, with no examples.
Thank you so much. Sarah, turning to you, you're in kind of the situation where a small country need to figure out AI. It sounds like it's an easy problem. You can just like look at all the many things that are out there and just pick and choose.
Yeah, pick and mix. So first of all, I will do my utmost that there is not a push for a Wellington Declaration or an Auckland Declaration. We don't need that. Yeah. So I guess zooming out from Karine's given a big picture, coming down to, as Andreas said, a small country. It's actually, in New Zealand, we haven't had an explicit approach to AI governance until very recently. And by AI governance, we think of it as a permission space. So it spans hard law through to voluntary guidelines that are letting people know where can you act, where should you not go. So that's sort of the general concept of AI governance for us. So in the middle of this year, government ministers agreed a strategic approach to AI. It sort of had a number of big blocks components, one of which was to make a bit more of the OECD principles, which we had signed up to when they initially came out, but then everyone sort of forgot about them. Another pillar was actually the government agreeing, well, AI is a good thing. We would like to encourage its use in the public sector and private sector. That might sound obvious, it's not. It was useful to have that signal from the government. And the third piece is specifically around governance, and that's taking a proportionate and risk-based approach to AI regulation. And the government's keen to use existing frameworks, existing laws, and to preference sort of agile approaches. So if you think of regulations spanning hard law through to the voluntary stuff, the voluntary stuff's a bit more agile to change, right? So there's a preference for using those types of instruments. There is a sense that we might need to review some pieces of legislation, but there's no appetite at this stage for a standalone AI Act. And frankly, this question of capacity, you look and think, oh my goodness, who would even embark on that within our small system? There's a desire to be a fast follower of good practices in peer countries, and that's where we really appreciate the work of the OECD and sort of showcasing what is out there and what others are doing. So just in terms of some of the key policies and pieces of law in New Zealand, we do have a range of laws that apply and give guardrails to AI. So we have a Privacy Act, there's the Human Rights Act, we've got the Crimes Act, Copyright Act, we have consumer protection legislation, and so on and so forth. And all of these are generally technology neutral laws. So in theory, they ought to be agile enough to change and accommodate new things that are coming out. Our Privacy Commissioner has actually issued specific guidance around generative AI. in terms of how they think the Privacy Act should apply. And there's a current debate actually about whether that act needs an update. Not necessarily in the way you might think. It's not all just clamping down. It is also actually thinking about whether there's anything in the Privacy Act that currently inhibits firms from using biometrics for things like crime prevention. So there's a bit of push and pull there. Outside of black letter law, we have things like in the public service, we have an algorithm charter, which is a commitment by agencies to be very careful about managing the use of algorithms, particularly for delivery of social services. We have a data ethics advisory group, which is an independent set of people that help agencies think through some of those questions about applying AI in their work. Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation, these things are springing up, and some living guidance on how agencies should use generative AI. So that's kind of the inward-looking aspect. Then, of course, there's the outward-looking aspect of what's the economy doing in terms of uptake of AI, and that's where, back in my day job, I work at the Ministry for Business, Innovation and Employment. We're working on an AI strategy, so maybe a decade after Canada, perhaps, but getting there. We're also looking at voluntary guidance for responsible AI in firms, which is sort of taking a strong lesson from this work and similar efforts in Singapore. So why did we go that route? I think the overall approach really sought to stay aligned with countries like the US, UK, Australia, and what we think of as our like-minded partners. And the reason for that is that we thought that these countries are taking a pro-innovation approach, which suits where we're headed. And helpfully, we are following. So there's a lot of smart people in the US, UK, Australia working on these issues, been working on it for a while, and we hope that we can learn some of the lessons there. The approach is and will continue to be tailored to a small country with a very small budget. And in that respect, I think Karine made some good points. When I think of the EU AI Act, wow, how on earth are they going to gear up to actually deliver all this, to monitor this, to enforce this? And then you think about translating that to a small country, there's just no way that you can embark on something like that. I think maybe where New Zealand might be starting to diverge a little bit is around this emphasis on AI safety. And I don't disagree that some aspects of that are important, but for me, it seems divorced from reality in some countries like New Zealand. So we're still just trying to leverage some of the great benefits from machine learning and robotics and all this sort of stuff. And that takes me back to sort of what I said in introductory remarks about context being important. New Zealand's been in the productivity doldrums for decades, right? Our tech sector is growing, but it's small. It's coming from a really small base. We're still quite reliant on selling primary products to the world. We have an aging population. We have really high expectations of our health and education sector that our taxes can't afford. We have an unpleasant hangover from COVID. So you put all that together and you can understand why the government's approach really is aiming to give confidence to the public sector and the private sector to adopt, to innovate with and to use AI, because the goal is actually productivity and growth above everything else.
Thank you so much. It was excellent. Thank you. Now we would have like a second or the last set of questions for all the panelists, but we're a little bit shorter on time, and I want to make sure we have enough time for questions. I will just introduce the question that was there, and then maybe we can globally discuss that with the entire workshop. And obviously, I'm curious about your reactions and thoughts and comments on what you've heard so far. So basically, the last question was the idea of like, what should actually governments regulate versus not when it comes to AI, right? What's space that is up for grab? What are governments currently doing or not doing in terms of regulation? What should they be doing or should not be doing? That was the questions. We can maybe get some of your thoughts on that later, but I want to at this point open up the conversation, see if there's any reactions, thoughts, or comments. What you've heard. Linda, please.
So I had a question about internal governance. So a lot of the discussions has been on how the private sector should behave, for example. What about internally, like as the government probably most likely will also adopt AI technologies for their own processes, how is the government adding checks and balances within the agencies to ensure that there isn't communities or groups that are going to be disproportionately targeted?
I can talk about the US then.
Please, yeah.
Okay. So in the executive order, there were a series of actions to GSA and OMB, so these are sort of the agencies in the US government that provide general services or help direct other functioning of the managed budget and help direct other functioning of US agencies. So they had a series of assignments. The other to sort of help guide procurement and use of AI in US agencies. There was also an initiative put together to get the chief AI officer in every US agency, which could be perceived as, you know, oh, you're adding a government position. It wasn't necessarily the case. They were so in some cases an honorific. I think at the Department of Commerce, it was an honorific in the sense that we had a team in the CIO, we have a CIO office, and there's a team of folks in the CIO's office who are constantly thinking about acquisition of products. There's product suites that we can use in government and how we FedRAMP onboard them, et cetera. And the chief AI officer became sort of one person in that team. Most of those acquisitions and the procurement there is in the context of government use of those systems, not necessarily, and at least it depends on the department, but it was more to do the business of the department, not necessarily to address it, like not to address a government service. So you're a little bit more removed from the citizen or the consumer, depending on how you define that, right? If you're looking at just the business of government. And so an example of that, and by the way, if it before, I can't remember exactly when this was, but either before the executive order came out or as part of it, there was a prohibition on US government agencies using AI. So on a government device, you couldn't use an AI, couldn't use ChatGPT or any of those systems because there was a concern around, you know, how that information was being stored, whether it was going to be secure, how information. So as a sort of general rule, there was no use of AI systems. That's changing slowly, and each agency is sort of put together. At Commerce, again, I can only really speak to Commerce. Everyone is approaching it slightly differently, but the Commerce approach was general ban, experimentation with sort of specific use cases. So each agency could put up a use case. NTIA said, oh, we want to try to look at whether we can use machine learning to help with federal spectrum allocation instead of right now it was a manual process. And so we thought this would be a good use case for us. We got approval to build a sort of a sandbox testing mechanism for that service. And, you know, there's sort of like rules around how you do the experimentation and use and everything else. So there's a sort of an AI governance council within the Department of Commerce to evaluate all of those experiments and how they're performing. But again, for the most part, and I was on the Council for Commerce, and for the most part, those experiments, at least within the commerce context, were about the business of government, not direct impact to consumer. There are rules around, or there's the formation of rules around how you might think of a procurement of services for service delivery to citizens, but that affected other agencies, and I'm not sure where they all stand.
Thank you.
I'd like to intervene in that. So again, yesterday we tried to emphasize that AI is just an extension of computing, right? So I've been watching the government adoption of computing, mostly in the US context, but also elsewhere around the world for about 30 years. And sometimes it's quite fun. For example, have you ever heard of the FISMA, the Federal Information Security Management Act? This was a law passed like 2000 or 2002 to make federal information systems more secure. And in that 20 years, of course, we've heard all kinds of problems with federal agencies being hacked and losing data, and sometimes just having really obsolete systems and very inefficient and unintegrated systems. So we went through a process starting in the Bush administration, Bush to kind of be more cyber secure in the federal government. But again, I think these kinds of, to me, this is not really an AI governance problem. It's an organizational governance problem. And it is useful to have, I guess, some form of expertise about AI applications, but it would be very context specific, right? So if the Justice Department is using AI to like predict who will be a criminal, I think lots of alarm bells would go off, but it would be under existing rules and standards. It wouldn't require a new law. It would be about, discrimination and due process. And if you're using an AI application to do spectrum allocation, or if the FCC is using it to like summarize a million comments that they get about net neutrality, that would be something completely different. And I just don't know that it is helpful to look at this as AI governance as much as organizational management of computing applications.
Of risk.
Or
It's
of risk.
organizational management of risk and
Yeah.
particular probabilities and impacts in that organization from the threat, well-defined, whatever it may be, and the language of it.
I will just maybe quick two finger on this. There is something to be said about that and the way that when there's a big push to get, there's a whole thing with government procurement. The AI applications are more expensive than regular when you come in and that's the case right now. Every company is marketing a product they might have had that wasn't necessarily an AI product, but now they're marketing it as an AI product, or they've like sprinkled magic fairy dust on it and now it's an AI product and they can charge twice the amount of money for it. That happens in the context of federal procurement too. So there is some value in having expertise or at least some skepticism from the procurement officials so that they know that they're not being sold a product for government services that is going to be a waste of the taxpayer money. Though there are procurement processes for that, but part of this is too, everyone is both wanting to prove that they're doing AI because that's the cool thing to do in government right now. So every agency is also sprinkling magic fairy dust on a program, and vendors are coming in to big, procurement environments and saying, oh, here's an application that you can use to do, spectrum allocation with AI. Well, maybe we don't need AI really, but we need to modernize the way that we're doing spectrum allocation. So there's other ways that we can, maybe it's AI, maybe it's not AI, maybe it's just sort of a better database and automated sort of decision trees around things that, it depends on how you define AI and it depends on how you do things, but you need some subject matter expertise to be able to distinguish between what is magic fairy dust and what is a real beneficial application.
But it's really ICT expertise, isn't it?
Right, it could be, it doesn't have to be AI expertise, it has to be expertise, maybe like a healthy dose of skepticism and knowledge of businesses and procurement risks. A combination of those skill sets.
Thank you. Victor and then Andrew, please.
Thank you. I wonder if we put aside, I want to jump back to the regulatory side and the regulatory initiatives. If we put aside the goals of regulation for a moment, and Milton kind of questioned on the goals, and focus on the means, on the mechanisms that have been chosen. To what extent would you say is there almost a lock-in that early on you have decided or identified a seemingly suitable mechanisms to regulate, and then you stick to that regulation or to that mechanism all through because you have had buy-in from various stakeholders, and then you can't move away from that mechanism anymore because you have that buy-in. And even though you have in the back of your brain second thoughts about the efficacy or the effectiveness of the mechanism, you still stick to it.
Can you be a little more specific about mechanisms? So, you know, we talked about risk, the AI risk management framework is an essential piece of the EO and being pushed. It's a framing of how you would deal with these kinds of problems.
I want it to be sort of abstract because there, if you look at the AI Act, it's kind of the kitchen sink approach. You know, you have so many different mechanisms in there, but in a way, in the EU context, sometimes you got one mechanism because you've got stakeholders to agree on this mechanism. If and only if you added a second mechanism as well. It was a deal basically, right? So you got risk management approach, but at the same time, you needed to have kind of a high risk bin, and the high risk bin had to have these three categories in there. And that was kind of the deal. And then you start having second thoughts whether that kind of binning actually makes sense and so forth. And at the same time, you're at a path, you are sort of locked in at that path because you made all these political deals and you can't get out of it. And at the same time, innovation in the AI space is very fast.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. No, especially for governments, right? As Grace pointed out, I mean, they're dealing with very different kinds of risks and potential impacts that they might have to deal with. And
So I wonder, what was your experience?
Okay, so I think, I said this yesterday, I think I'm in theory very interested in adaptive policy. I think in practice it works rarely, or people rarely go back and say, was this a policy that worked? Should we continue that policy? We rarely have sunset rules or reevaluation rules in our laws, although I think that would be a good design mechanism.
Right.
So that aside from like the beauty of public policy theory to like execution, the advantage, in some ways, you might say that the advantage of the US approach where we have all voluntary commitments and executive orders that can be revoked on day one of a new administration. The advantage is maybe that's the natural way of reevaluating whether something is worth keeping or not. I don't love that because there's a ton of, if you're thinking purely from government efficiency, there's a ton of spending and budget and time and allocation of resources, and we reprioritize an entire division of NTIA to work on AI work, you know, like it's a huge waste of government resources to do these, to make these major shifts. You imagine you have a Titanic and you're turning it this way, and then all of a sudden you say, oh, we're gonna actually turn it this way. And you spend all this time realigning, you're wasting taxpayer dollars, right? So to the extent that you can design things, even if you're taking a more cautious approach at the outset, I think to the extent that you can design things that are lightweight and movable and less, that to me, that's a compelling approach because you eliminate the sort of potential for waste that can happen when you're constantly shifting an entire workforce. And the government workforce is 1 million people, right? Maybe more, 3 million. Yeah. So you're constantly shifting that entire route if you have really stringent regulations that you then decide to change. So but there isn't a real mechanism for reevaluating that other than a new administration at this point.
But I guess my question was slightly different than that, is how often did you have to make these political agreements that locked you into certain mechanisms?
Nothing is really all that locked in.
There's no mechanisms in the
well,
US really, right?
Okay, one thing that
Executive order, and that required buy-in from certain stakeholders.
it did, which is part of the reason why it's a long document, right?
Exactly.
But the other thing is that, you know, in the absence, I think there was some hope that maybe we could get a law passed for certain things or whatever. In the absence of being able to do that, you end up in a situation where you want to be able to show progress and you want to be able to show people that you're doing something. So you do voluntary agreements. So you bring in a bunch of organizations, companies, civil society groups, academia, and you get them to sign and, you know, or make a statement that they're buying into, like they're committing to voluntary approaches for responsible development or things like that. In practice, it's very hard to hold them accountable. And I think you've seen a few efforts. The Commerce Secretary did attempted to do this where she would bring people back. She said, you signed these voluntary agreements or you agreed to these things. What is your progress? What's the update? And we tried to do that a few times, but practically it's still all voluntary. And so it's very hard it's a very hard mechanism to use. It's imperfect and it's what we had in the moment, I guess.
Sarah has a quick response to that, and then I wanna go to Andrew.
I imagine Karine's probably got some experience on
Political trade-offs, yeah.
political trade-offs and what the changes that countries have made, but just a couple of points that I would make is it's a matter of life and governments that you chop and change, and you know, government changes and they get rid of what the previous government did and move to something else. What I perceive there to be in AI is that certainly in the US there seems to be some level of bipartisanship. I understand, you know, there's a Senate caucus, a House caucus that get together, and I think that helps. In New Zealand, there's the same sort of thing emerging where our Minister of Science, Innovation and Tech is trying to go across all the parties involved in government to get a little bit of agreement on the direction, which I think helps. And the second thing is that, you know, we're always looking out for evidence. And while it's true that you might not conduct formal evaluations and so forth, there's always going to be times where you take evidence to your stakeholders and say, look, the world's changed a little bit. Let's talk about this. And so the role of public consultation, I think, is important. And sort of bringing along those groups. So in New Zealand, we try to stay well connected with industry representatives, with our universities, and sort of the expert community, so that we are taking them with us when we're thinking about our policy changes and our choices.
Thank you. Andrew.
So
Sorry. It's okay if Karine, please go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
I just wanted to add a little bit to what Sarah was saying, that in addition to different stakeholder groups, and I mean, I think it's really important to consider countries that are in different regions and in different at different levels of development, because AI is going to be of special relevance to some of them, and key to boost some of their, you know, economic growth and improve the quality of life and education systems and so on. And I'm saying that just because we've been organizing, not just because, but also in the context of a number of African dialogues we've been organizing with the African Union, which really brought that across very clearly, and also dialogues with the LAC countries, where the perception of AI is completely different. It's really, how can it help us? And it's not this kind of more European perspective, which is a little bit more, let's say, risk averse. And then I also wanted to flag that in the area of AI, it's really not just the governments that matter here, because the cutting edge of AI research is happening in research labs, and many of those are in companies, and not many people know exactly what's happening. And here I'd just like to flag something that we're doing, that we've been working on for 3 years now, and it's going to be completed soon. I think voluntary approaches, as you know, are not just for show, but they're also a way of testing kind of different mechanisms and getting some feedback, and that's why we're monitoring the G7 commitments. I also wanted to mention that this initiative that we've been working on, which is called Responsible Business Conduct for AI, and this is kind of a hybrid mechanism, so it's partly binding. But what I think is interesting and different about it, and you might think I'm contradicting myself, that we have all these voluntary different mechanisms, and they look different and feel different. But this is actually somewhat different in the sense that it doesn't cover just the life cycle of an AI system. So basically the development and the deployment, but it covers the entire life cycle. So it'll include all the activities that are going to, all the business relationships that AI actors are going to be involved in upstream. So the investors with compute providers. Compute providers are super important because they actually know a lot of what is happening with their hardware. So all the upstream relationships, and then of course you're going to have the life cycle of an AI system, and there we're well covered with voluntary mechanisms, and we're working very hard on mechanisms for safety by design or trustworthiness by design, or whatever you call it. Some people call it ethics by design. I don't know what ethics means, but but after that, once you've got the AI system deployed in the real world, you have actors that are going to be using that, and they're going to be using it in different ways. So it covers the entire chain of the AI system, the value chain of an AI system, which is I think important to include the starting bit and the ending bit, because it's not all happening in the middle. A lot of is happening before, and there's a lot of leverage mechanisms that are available before and after. And also the nice thing about this tool, and this goes back to a previous point I made, is that it includes redress mechanisms that are already in force in over 50 countries, which provide for mediation and arbitration in the case of complaints. So dispute resolution. So it's a beginning. Of course, it's not universal. It's going to be adopted, I think, next year in May. But it's a beginning, and I think it's a possibly positive way of moving forward. One of several ways. We're not going to just be able to use one tool. We're going to need a gamut of policy tools, probably.
Thank you. Andrew.
Do we do time somewhere that we've got I don't want to.
Sorry, say again.
We have time, so I want to get into our break if we're.
If you want to just add the question.
Sure, really quick. It's a fascinating discussion. I think one question I have for you is about just thinking about the pressures or incentives, the kind of regulatory culture that actually leads to enforcement. I'm struck that here in the US, the FTC has had essentially a strong go-ahead from this administration to pursue certain remedies. You also have a court system here that seems to be very willing to back their theory of change. It's quite the opposite in the UK, where we have a CMA. It's incredibly well-resourced, incredibly capable, brilliant people there, but has essentially been told by our current Labour government to sort of stop all the activity on merged acquisitions, on certain investigations, and it's a really hostile court process. So I guess I was just curious if you can talk a bit about that aspect of enforcement that you're seeing in regulation, and what other kinds of levers or other kinds of cultural, I guess, enablers to be in place effectively.
No, I agree that the in theory, I think the FCC has a lot of ability to enforce. I think this is my personal view. I'm still confused about the theory, the approach the FTC wants to take. I don't quite understand what the strategy is there. And I think and I'm not necessarily I'm not the FTC expert, but I think if I don't know what the strategy is, then that's probably a reflection on, this is sort of maybe there are a lot of other people in the tech policy space or otherwise who would be able to understand that strategy, who if I'm confused, there probably are others that are confused. So I think that maybe what is needed there is an articulation of the approach of the strategy. And maybe that by design, the FTC has chosen not to do that because they want to be able to pick and choose or to act without directing. Once you outline your strategy, then people realign accordingly. There was a blog at one point that the FTC put out about how this sort of was you better behave on AI or else we're coming after you blog. And I was kind of excited. I thought, okay, this is interesting. What do they mean by that? But then there was never any clarity on what that meant, and I'm not sure that I've seen exactly what the approach there is. So I think it's a little bit of a missed opportunity. But that's, I have not been close enough to the FTC to know exactly what that is. That's my sort of private view.
Thank you, Grace. I think we're coming to the end of this panel. Grace, Sarah, Karen, thank you so much for your excellent comments. I really much enjoyed that. Thank you everyone in the audience for the questions and the interactions. And I think with that, Kareem, back to you.
Yeah, well, we'll just take a short 15-minute break and reconvene at 10:35. Thank you.